Summer's going fast, nights growing colder. Children growing up, old friends growing older. Freeze this moment a little bit longer. Make each sensation a little bit stronger. Experience slips away. Experience slips away.
Good morning and welcome back. How many of you did your homework? A few of you. The rest of you? Well, a couple of you are like, I wasn't here last week. I don't know what the homework was. You get off the hook. But I challenged you last week, if you have access to someone who has a Netflix account, to watch the movie A Man Called Otto. I don't remember if I warned you. It's not the kind of movie for very young children because it has some very adult scenes in it. If you've not got access to A Man Called Otto, call us, come over to the house one night. We'll give you some iced tea and cheese and crackers, and we'll put the dog in the back, and we'll watch it again together because it's a really good movie. But it is Tom Hanks playing the key character, and he plays an irritable old man wonderfully. And I had planned this sermon weeks earlier, and I'm always amazed at how things unfold, not realizing that this sermon would harmonize with this movie so well. I watched the movie a little bit before Sunday last week and just went, wow. And I looked at my schedule to see when my sermon dealing with grief was, and it was this next week. Friends, that's a God thing. That's just, and I want to thank God for being in that process of preparation and planning. So this morning, in a few moments, we're going to be looking at two passages from the life of David. One of them is in 2 Samuel chapter 12. The other is in 2 Samuel chapter 18. I've got enough verses, I just could not fit them in the bulletin, but that gives you more room for notes if you want to do that. But to not give too much of the movie away, Otto is a man you meet, and he lives in this little community. It's kind of a housing association, but they're kind of condos, one after the next after the next. And he's lived there basically his whole adult life. And you meet him basically on the day of his retirement. And he's not happy about it. He's not happy about having to give up his job. He's not happy about being replaced by a younger man who was paid more money and so on and so forth. Everybody he meets, he's pretty irritable with. I mean, it's hard to escape the conclusion at the beginning of the movie that he's not just a mean old man. But as the movie unfolds, you begin to see not just that he's irritable or hateful or mean, you see that he's hurting. He's hurting in ways that most people cannot see. The world around him is changing. The people who lived in all these other condos, some of them have gone to nursing homes, some of them have died. And new people moved in, and it was his assessment that these new people are idiots. That's exactly right. Everybody he thought was an idiot. Having interacted with a fair amount of the public, he might have been right in one or two cases, but that's another subject this morning. But you find along the way that his wife had died. And years earlier, she had lost the ability to walk, had been paralyzed from the waist down. And at the time of the accident that took her legs, she was pregnant with their first child. She would never have another. As you watch the movie, if you have any life experience at all, you recognize the signs of pain, the signs of loss, and the desire at times to just not go any farther. All of these things fit in the category of grief. I want us this morning to look in the Scriptures at one character, but at two different stages of life. And this character, I must say, is my favorite Bible character, which all of them are my favorite, but this one has been my favoritist for the longest. When I was, 8, 9, 10 years of age, it was after 9, somewhere 10 or 11 years of age, I finally decided that just listening to my father preach and listening to the Sunday school teacher was not sufficient. I picked up a Bible that my mother gave me. I still have this Bible. On January the 15th, 1974, and the inscription says, per his 9th birthday. And somewhere along the way, I said, well, I'll start reading the Bible for myself. And rather than just picking up and beginning on page 1, I can tell you the house I was in. I can tell you the room that I was in. I know where the bed was. It was late at night, and I had a reading lamp, and I turned it on, and I flipped through it, and remembering the sermons and the lessons that I had heard, I thought, well, if I'm going to read, I'd like to read something interesting. Don't ever let someone start in the book of Leviticus, because whatever it is, it's not interesting, but that's another sermon. So my dad had told me, when you want to find something in the Bible, you flip it to the back, and usually there's a concordance. Look for a word, and I looked for David and Goliath. I didn't know where to find David and Goliath, but my concordance helped me, and I started reading the stories of how David fought the giant killer, and all of the stories. The During the day, we played army, and at night, I read the Bible to get some strategy because David was always on the run and he was always fighting someone. And David is one of the few characters that we see broad pictures of their life, not just a particular moment in time, but you see David as a young man and as a young adult and even as an old man. So we get to see some snapshots of David dealing with grief. So this morning, I'm going to read the two and then we'll go back and talk about their context this morning. But from 2 Samuel chapter 12, we're going to read beginning in verse 16 down through verse 20. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused. He would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house. And at his request, they served him food, and he ate. He was king, relatively young. The next picture we look at is years later when his children were grown. From chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." The first passage that we read, came from that instance in David's life when he had, in a very sordid story, he had procured another man's wife. He had a soldier named Uriah the Hittite, and Uriah had a beautiful wife, and David wanted her, and David had her. Uriah ends up dead. Bathsheba moves into the palace, and just a few months later, she delivers their son. Nathan the prophet brought news that that son would not survive. And David and Bathsheba had all the dreams of what they hoped for. They hoped for all of the things that we grandparents now rejoice when we see our grandchildren doing. I've got a grandchild that I have celebrated because she has gone from crawling to now she can pull herself up and with her hands on something, walk, and she's, doing baby talk, but she's trying to do adult talk. She's going from to trying to form words. And you dream of all that is to come. And before the child died, you would say, we saw David grieving. I don't know if grieving is the right word. We saw David pleading. "Oh, Lord God, you have the power. Let my child live." And for 7 days, he wallowed in sackcloth and ashes. It was a visible way of reflecting the contriteness of his heart. His prayers were answered with a no. And having watched him over the course of a week, his attendant said, "Well, he's been so bad up to this moment. it's only going to get worse because now his child has died. Now is when the grief actually starts. And to their shock and dismay, he stopped looking sad. He stopped depriving himself. He went, cleaned up his raiment, his self, his hygiene. He washed and changed clothes and went and worshiped God. And he called for food. If you enjoy that kind of complexity of that story, you should go home and read the rest of that 12th chapter, because they ask him, why is it when the child was alive you acted so down in the dumps, and now that the child has died you're not down? Why aren't you grieving worse? And I'll let you read David's reply. I'll give you the synopsis of it. I prayed all I could, and now that the child is dead, I cannot bring him back. He will not come to me, but eventually I will go to meet him. Then, I don't know, 20 or so years later, 20, 25, 30 years later, David's son Absalom. David was not a good father. You can quote me all the scriptures you want about David being a man after God's own heart, but he just could not deal, I don't know the right word, he could not say no to his children. David's oldest surviving son, a young man by the name of Amnon, looked at his half-sister, wanted her, arranged for circumstances to get her alone. He raped her. There's no other way to put it. I mean, he forced himself on her and then cast her out. And you know what David did to his son? Not one thing. Not even shake his finger at him as far as what we know from the text. But she was Absalom's full-blooded sister. And Absalom didn't take it quite as well as Dad did. And he killed Amnon. David, it was against the law to kill somebody, especially when you're killing one of the king's sons, even if you were another one of the king's sons. But other than saying, well, Absalom, you've got to leave town, you can't live here, David does nothing else. There is no trial. There is no retribution. And eventually Absalom is allowed to come home. Absalom doesn't seem to respect his father very much, and eventually Absalom takes up the fine art of politics. Israel at that time did not have a complex judicial system. So if you needed a judgment, you came and waited in line for the king. And if the king was busy, you didn't get to see him. So Absalom sets his chair outside the palace, and as people come in and as they go out, some of those going out having never been able to see the king, Absalom will say, well, boy, I'll use modern language. If I was elected, I would take care of this. If I was king, you would get justice. If I was king, I would solve the problems. And some people went home and said, boy, that kid's got a big mouth. And other people went home and go, you know what? We need somebody else. I laughed at a friend years ago when they voted for someone and I just didn't see it. And we're talking 25 years ago, I guess. They voted for somebody and I just couldn't understand it. And they looked at me and said, well, I just thought we needed a change. And I said, well, by grannies, you sure got it, didn't you? And they're like, yeah, I did. So there were some people who said, we need a change. David has been here for decades now, and he's not doing everything perfectly. And by the way, no one ever does. So Absalom rounded up himself an army. And before David knew what was happening, he marched on the capital, and David's advisor said, Dave, you got to get out of town, and you got to do so now, because he's coming and they're loaded for bear. And David and a few of his attendants escaped to the hills back when he was a young man, and Absalom came in. And everybody's wondering, well, would Absalom actually make peace with Dad if Dad, did things better, did things right? So to allay their fears, how do you support a guy if he's going to then just let the other king come back? So Absalom says, I'll show you what I think of Dad. And up on top of the palace, which was the tallest building within eyesight, he set up a tent and brought David's concubines out. And one by one marched them into the tent where he lay with them, to establish a permanent breach between himself and his father. Absalom's not a nice guy. He and his father, from the evidence we have in Scripture, never had a close relationship. We don't have anything, surely when Absalom was young, maybe they had some of these great family moments, but you have intrigue and treachery and betrayal and rebellion. So finally, David's army gets organized, and Absalom's army, they march out to the battlefield, and it's touch and go for a while. It is very unclear who will win the battle, but the Lord was with David, and David was with the Lord in this instance, and David's troops overcame those of Absalom. And Absalom had to get on his mule and run for the hills. But Sheila, I'll use you because Sheila got that long head of hair. Absalom had a long head of hair like that. And as he was galloping on his mule, that hair's flying in the wind, and he run under some kind of a tree. I don't know why. I picture a crepe myrtle tree. You pick the tree that you want. And the limbs of that tree entangled his hair, and the mule runs right out from under him, and he's hanging by that head of hair. And all of David's army soldiers are like, that's the king's son. King said, don't mess with that son. But Joab, the general of the army, what are you people doing sitting here waiting? And Joab went and ran some spears through him. And David's son died. Now, Joab was not a dummy. Joab didn't get on his mule and ride back to town and say, "Oh, king, I'm your general, and we won, and we struck down your son." Oh, no. He got a foreigner to go deliver the news. Somebody that was, they wouldn't miss him if he was gone. You go tell Dave. And then you had this, how do I say it kindly? One of those people that like to suck up to other people. Joab, send me. He said, look, you don't want this job. So he sends the Cushite after him. And the other guy, and I forget the other guy's name, kept just needling Joab. Let me go. And Joab finally says, well, the other guy's had a head start. Okay, you can go. And this guy, trying to curry favor with the king, took a shortcut and beat the Cushite there and said, everything's fine. How about my son? Oh, I don't know. He wanted to be the guy that brought the news first, but he knew he wasn't so out of tune with the setting that telling the king that his son's dead is not a safe thing to tell. So the Cushite comes in, and the Cushite, how's my son? The king says, and the Cushite says, well, may all your enemies be the way that one is. In other words, your son is dead, and we hope that everybody else who rises against you will die. So in one instance, the innocent baby boy that he longed for, firstborn in his family as far as we know, dies, and David seems to take it in stride. And the son who had done almost unspeakable harm, who had been treacherous and had been responsible for the death of another of his sons, and David breaks down. And he said, I wish that I had died instead of my son. I've always kind of thought, well, David, if that was your real attitude, why did you have the war? Why didn't you say you can have it? I'm not here to break down the theology. I'm here to examine together and to observe how at different stages of life we deal with things differently. And to begin, we must understand what grief is. Back when I was in school, we had a device that we were able to play with just a little bit. A good old-fashioned scale. And we had those little, I guess they were brass weights, and each of them had a marking, a gram and an ounce and various things. And we would pile those things on there, and the scales would go back and forth. And what happens is, if I've got my scale balanced, and I take something off on this side, let's say this is, you can figure it good and bad, however you want to figure it. You take something off on one side, the other side crashes. Grief is a loss. Any kind of loss that takes your life out of balance. And once your life is out of balance, we struggle to return to balance. I didn't ask my wife's permission, but sometimes forgiveness is easier. Just this week, we had to take her car in to get a little service. And as she was coming back, it was going to take a while, so they ran her back to the house. And the girl who worked in the front office started to talk about Jacob. Jacob died, this year will be 8 years. Died in 2015. And the lady started to talk about how where she works, somebody just about every week comes in and starts talking about Jacob. Talking about something he did or something he said. And as she came home and told me this, in one sense, this causes you to revisit what for her had to be the worst day of her life. And I watched her smile as she recounted how others continue to treasure Jacob. And you know what I saw? A life that had found a new balance, not the same balance. The grief was there, but on the other side was the appreciation, the joy. You must learn in life that number one, grief will come to you. It will come in many different shapes. It will come in many different forms. And you can try as you might, but you will not escape loss. Sometimes the loss is a devastating loss like that of a family member. I've described before that year, 2015, that was a rough one. We had 3 losses between us, if my memory serves. In June, July, we went to the beach and Jacob stayed home. And I had been between churches, and there was a time there I was lost. And somebody advertised a free dog. And I went and met the person and met the dog, and by that evening, Donna comes home and she's looking at me like, what's this great big dog doing on our front porch? She's pretty tough on dogs, by the way. She told me, I don't want animals in the house. I especially don't want animals in the bed, and she's broke every one of those things that she didn't want. Jasper was his name, and one night, because we heat with wood, I'd let him in the cold weather, I'd let him into the basement. That's not technically in the house. And we keep the basement door open because the wood stove's in the basement. And I hear, he was half Labrador and half pit bull. Big, tall dog, muscular. And I hear him tiptoeing up those steps. And I heard those tiptoes get on the tile floor in the kitchen. I said, "What are you doing?" And he froze. And Don and I were sitting together, and she said, "I've been letting him upstairs when you're not home." The summer of 15, we're at the beach. And Jacob calls and says, "Well, I let Jasper out." He let him out every evening and said, "He's gone." I said, "He'll be back tomorrow. He's chasing a rabbit or something." And on the next day, Jacob was so worried, he called her sister and got her involved, and they called the pound, and the pound said, "We picked up a dog that had been hit right down at the schoolhouse." We took the call at Rockingham. We were on our way back. And I cried all the way till Greensboro. Couldn't really begin to talk about it till we got to Danville. That was June. No, that was probably May. Eight years ago tomorrow, my daddy died. Dad was, 87 years of age. Dad had cancer, and we had been granted some extra years through a very miraculous gift of God. And yes, when Dad died, it hurt. And I had some tears, but I didn't cry as much for Dad as I did for my dog. That's not assessing their worth. It illustrates how every time you grieve, it will be different. It will be unique. Sometimes when you see it approaching, you can prepare for it, and sometimes it will catch you so unprepared that it will turn your world upside down. Every loss is different. Every grief is different, and every response is different. That becomes a challenge when someone else goes through a trauma and they call the preacher and says, "Pastor, what do I do?" And I said, "I haven't the faintest clue other than just walk through it. Because how you face it today will be different than you would have faced it yesterday. It's different from the way I faced it." It would be later that summer and into the fall when we lost Jacob. And it was a different grief. As human beings, we like to investigate things. We like to describe things. We like to define things. If we have a definition, we can just plug ourselves into the definition. It was in I think it was the early 1960s. It might have been before that, but sometime during that time, a psychologist by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with something that every one of you are familiar with, whether you know it or not. The so-called 5 stages of grief. And we understand them. The denial, that moment when we say, "It just can't be true." Anger, when we are mad that it will. Sometimes we're even mad at God for God allowing it to happen. And then I've seen it when people bargain, "Oh God, if you'll just give me this, I'll do anything you'll say." And then when the reality sets in, there is depression and ultimately acceptance. And this is a beautiful model. But the reality is, because every grief is unique, you can't just say, "Well, I'm in step 1, then I'll move to step 2. They don't come in this particular order. And in fact, there are other steps that you may experience, and some of these you may not. I have seen people, when dealing with a loss, who would experience, besides these stages, things like guilt. I will not give names, but I have seen people that when a loved one died, they were relieved. Not because they hated the person, but because of the burden that it put upon them. I have seen people that they celebrated because the life had been so profound And because of their faith, they looked ahead to more and they celebrated the meaning of life. I have seen people who dealt with questions. I've seen people who struggled with anxiety, with doubt, with fear. Some people just wanted to escape. I knew of a case where some family members were staying with a parent. The parent wanted to die at home. And on a given morning, it was pretty obvious it was going to be today. And as two siblings were there, one sibling basically took their place at the bedside. The other sibling went to town and said, "Call me when it's over." Some people escape because they just don't want to face it. And I've had a few that were, they experienced in their grief what I call aggrandizement. I had this one situation where a couple, they were older than me. I was a younger pastor, and they came to my house one day, and with cursing, the woman told me how bad it had been with this man who was her husband. And a couple of years later, cancer claimed his life, and she told me how wonderful it was. That's where I apply that old truth. Well, there's your truth and their truth, and the real truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But he was the best man that ever been. She said, "I'll never find another. I won't even look for another man." Nobody could measure up to him. And I just can't say it at those times. Well, you were cussing him just, 18 months earlier. How terrible he was. But that's the way we grieve at times. What I want to tell you this morning is your grief, your response to loss will be unique to you and to the situation. So don't get so caught up on 5 stages of grief that everything has to fit in. Don't be afraid to be you. Don't be afraid to experience your losses in the ways that you have to go through. Sometimes your path and my path or anyone else's path will be different, and there is no need for you to retrace someone else's steps. One thing I can tell you, however, is that grief, not only will it change you, but it will take time to work through. I sometimes read those little stories that you see posted online. One of those collections of stories was a story about bad employers made ridiculous demands. And one of the stories one of the stories was about a company. I don't know the business they were in. I know they were overloaded, overworked, short-staffed. And one of the workers who was beloved died. And the management posted a sign that basically said, "Well, if you need to take 15 minutes, be sure you clock out to express your grief." And that person, remember, was a good worker, and they wouldn't want you to slow the rest of us down, so get back to work. What an idiot that 15 minutes could resolve such a thing. Grieving takes time. Can I tell just a little bit more of your story? Well, that's good. She doesn't know, so she can't say no. When Jacob passed, I tried to be there for her. And she went above and beyond the call to be there for many others. Her other son, her nieces, the rest of her family. I saw your heart. And your heart is just as pretty as you are. I guess it was close to 2 years later that I saw her kind of, not completely, but kind of fall apart. That's her story to tell, but I'll tell this one little piece of it. She said, "I don't think I was able to completely grieve." You couldn't put it on a calendar and schedule, this is the time for grief. It has to happen when it happens. You see, one of the strategies that so often we put into place, and I think David probably did this with the instance with his son Amnon and then later with Absalom. We try to cover it over. I cut a whole lot of wood. Alan cut a whole lot of wood this year. Now you go shake Alan's hands. I want you to feel it because he's got them rough, tough hands. I don't know if it's stubbornness or ignorant or just tough. But the man won't even use gloves when he cuts wood. Huh? All of the above, well. But I know that in my experience, when I cut a whole lot of wood and split a whole lot of wood, if I don't have my gloves on, you know what I get? I get a whole lot of splinters. And I've done it more times than I'd count. Going back to work. Any of you have a child who had a splinter? What'd you do? Did you tell that child, go on back to work? No, you called Mama. And Mama went to the medicine cabinet and she came out with her tweezers. And if she was like my mama, the tweezers and a needle. And you dug that thing out. You know why? I could have put the pictures of a splinter that people left in place for a week or two. And those pictures were just kind of gruesome. They were red and swollen and infected and filled with pus. Because a wound that leaves a splinter will fester if you do not get it out. And grief that you try to push down so nobody else will see it will fester in your heart if you refuse to face it and let it out. Grief must be brought out. Otto had so much grief. But a family moved in across the way from him. A woman, a couple of children, and they were pregnant with another one, and a husband, and he was kind of an idiot. Let me put it this way, he was a city boy who didn't know how to fix anything. I love, there's a scene in it where he wants to borrow Otto's ladder to get on the second floor to open the window. And all of us watching the movie said, did you think about just going up into the attic and doing it from the inside? Oh no, city boy had to climb the ladder, city boy falls off, city boy breaks leg. But the mother, hearing the hateful tone in this man's voice, saw something. And she just wouldn't let him run her off. Not all grief is yours. Sometimes it is your job to help someone else by letting them be, even if that means for a time, not forever, ornery, impolite, maybe a little mean. The beauty of the story of Otto is towards the end of the movie, he learned to smile again. If that picture were blown out a little farther, you would see that he's holding a cat in his arm. That was the scraggliest looking cat when it first came on the screen, but that cat took up with Otto. That family took up with Otto. And his scales never recovered that which he had lost, but he added joy back to life. You see, here's the trick with grief. You can be crippled for the rest of your life trying to get back which you can never have again, or you can find new areas in which to focus your heart. I don't know after the loss of Absalom, if you're a critical reader, David was never joyous again, it seems. He was never vital again. He got to be a kind of a withered old man after that. I'll bet everybody here has seen a loss. And everybody here has heard the Bible story how Jesus in John chapter 19 was on the cross, and he knew his mother standing below him was not going to get him back, even though he would be resurrected. He would ascend into heaven. And in one of the most profound moments of the cross, he looks down and says, "Woman, you see my disciple there?" I'm paraphrasing, of course. The old King James says, "Behold your son." Let me rephrase it. Mom, there are other people that you could love. The love you would have poured out on me for the rest of my earthly life, why don't you let that love focus over here? And son, we think that man was John. John, I want you to love my mother because she's going to have a hole in her heart. Another way to paraphrase it is, Mom, John, I want the two of you to go on living. In the privacy of your heart right now. I see in some of your eyes, and I imagine for the rest of you, there are some losses that you would do anything to undo. And with no critical intent, you cannot undo those things. But you can spend your life focusing on what you don't have anymore, or you can spend your life focusing your heart on what you do have. Where is your focus today? On the losses that have been taken from you? Or on the life that is still yours to have? If you have not watched Otto, you ought to. And when you see him finding new joy, it might remind you that life may never be the same, but it still goes forward. You ever feel out of balance? Tomorrow will be the 8th anniversary of my father's passing. And for me, it's just another day. The grief and the loss that I experience has no attachment to a certain calendar day. But when summer turns to fall, as we approach October and the anniversary of Jacob's death, Donna will be affected. Which of us is right? Both. That's exactly right, because we each grieve our own way. So since I don't attach something to the day, I don't need to make plans for tomorrow. But she taught me something. We're going to be away the weekend of October 19th, whatever the calendar date is most closely attached to that date. And every year she has learned to plan a retreat, because as that date comes, it weighs heavier and heavier. The dread that day is coming back. And she learned to plan something to look forward to. Something that she can be excited about. It doesn't take it away, it doesn't solve it, but it brings her back in balance. Focus your heart on the life that you have. As long as you have it. Celebrate it. Remember them. Oh, laugh, tell the stories again and again. And remember that what life has taken from us, God holds safely in His hand until we join Him in heaven. Father, thank you that in the worst of our grief, you bring hope. Help each of us to live in that hope. We ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Summer's going fast, night's growing colder. Children growing up, old friends growing older. experience.